leader's Green New Deal resolution, a resolution that ironically he does not apparently support. First, I want to say this about the Green New Deal. Even our Republican friends cannot deny that this resolution has sparked a national conversation and generated a great deal of enthusiasm among the American people, especially among younger Americans. It reminds me of the time, Mr. President, when I was a young naval flight officer stationed at Moffett Field Naval Air Station just south of San Francisco, waiting to be deployed to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. I joined millions of Americans across our country that year in celebrating our nation's very first Earth Day. As I listened to the rising chorus of voices calling for climate action today, Mr. President, I hear the sounds of that day in Golden Gate Park. I remember the urgency we felt then to address the environmental challenges facing our nation and our world, and I feel an even greater sense of urgency today. That's why it's so disappointing to me that our Republican colleagues, not all of them, but a number of them, are trying to make a mockery of the very real concerns and the passionate calls for action that we're hearing from people across this country and indeed around the world. This is not a time for a derision. This is not a time for division. On an issue as serious as this for Mr. President, we ought to be serious about addressing it. However, it's become clear that some, not all, some of our Republican friends would rather just have some fun and talk maybe about hamburgers and cheeseburgers and that kind of thing. Worse, some have conflated meaningful action on climate change with socialism. Mr. President, with the death of our late colleague, John McCain, I am the last Vietnam veteran serving in the United States Senate. I served 5 years during a hot war in Southeast Asia to oppose the expansion of communism. Shortly after we celebrated that first ever Earth Day in 1970, I was sent on my first of 3 deployments to Southeast Asia, before eventually serving another 18 years until the end of the Cold War as a Navy P-3 aircraft mission commander in the Naval Reserve and retiring as a naval captain after chasing Soviet submarines in all the oceans of the world. I'm not a socialist. Like most of our colleagues here, I am an American patriot and proud to be one. I care deeply about this planet, and I know we can have cleaner air and water while creating jobs. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Our Republican colleagues know better than that, and they owe our country better than that. In recent weeks, Mr. President, our Republican colleagues have thrown around a $93 trillion number. That wildly overestimated number primarily refers to provisions in the Green New Deal that are not directly related to climate change. And at a time when our country is looking to Congress for leadership on climate action, hiding behind political games, deception, and scare tactics is irresponsible. It's cowardly when we ought to be brave. Right now, a clear majority of Americans want us in Congress to address the growing climate crisis that's facing our country and our planet. We should be having a fact-based, policy-driven conversation about tackling this crisis. And we should be talking about the real costs that confront us, including the cost of inaction. I live in Delaware, lowest lying state in our country. Our state is sinking. The oceans around us are rising. According to our nation's leading scientists, climate change unchecked means more sea level rise, costing coastal communities up and down the East Coast, like my state, trillions of dollars in economic damages over the next 80 years. In the Northeast, we're experiencing rain events where we are measuring rain by the foot, not the inch. Not too far from where we stand here today in Ellicott City, Maryland, Ellicott City has withstood not one but 2 1,000-year floods in less than 2 years. Think about that. They've withstood not one but 2,000-year floods in less than 2 years. Today, our neighbors across the Missouri River Basin, our hearts go out to them, but they're suffering through catastrophic flooding. And as of Friday, the cost of damage to Nebraska alone already surpassed $1.3 billion. And the damage to Iowa alone was estimated at $1.6 billion. Some cities are currently without fresh water. In Missouri, entire communities have been evacuated. In northwestern Missouri, roughly 40,000 acres of farmland was still underwater this past Friday. Our nation's scientists tell us that climate change unchecked means more frequent and more intense storms, meaning bomb cyclones. I didn't even know there was such a thing, bomb cyclones, but there are. Intense rainfalls and Category 5 hurricanes become the new normal. Last year, we witnessed the tragic devastation caused by wildfires, fueled by drought and by heat, like the California wildfires. Imagine what we could face in 2050 when, according to our nation's scientists, wildfire seasons burn up to 6 times more forest area each year. The extreme weather events we see today are already taking a toll on American lives, on American livelihoods, and on our nation's budget. According to NOAA, in 2017 alone, extreme weather cost Americans $300 billion in economic damages, a new record. That same year, the federal government spent $120 billion in federal disaster spending for just 4 extreme weather events, just 4. Earlier this month, the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office released its biennial high-risk list and once again identified climate change as a significant fiscal risk to the federal government, and I might add, to taxpayers. According to GAO, since 2005, federal funding for disaster assistance has reached $430 billion, nearly $500 billion, and those costs will continue to rise. GAO says, and I quote, "Disaster costs are projected to increase as extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change," close quote. NOAA and NASA tell us these numbers will be a drop in the bucket compared to our new climate future if we do not act on climate change. If we do not change course, Mr. President, just about every major economic sector in the United States will be negatively affected by climate change by the turn of this century. And some sectors could see hundreds of billions of dollars of losses every year. Add it all up, and climate change could slash up to 10% of our gross domestic product, GDP, by 2100. I like to say, compared to what? Well, for context, that would be more than double the losses incurred during the Great Recession of the last decade. More than double the losses of the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression. However, all these costs are woefully underestimated. How can we truly put a price tag on the toll of this destruction? What is the cost for a fourth generation farm family that loses their land and their livestock? What is the cost of a bridge inundated by water, separating a community from a hospital or other emergency services? What is the cost of a family that loses a child to an asthma attack on a high particular matter day? The circumstances I've laid out are dire because that is the crisis we face, and we cannot evade it into oblivion. This poster says it all. No matter where we live, we can't ignore the reality of climate change or its effect. We have to accept and address this crisis, but as Albert Einstein once said, in adversity lies opportunity. And that opportunity before us is even greater. More than 3 million people have gone to work in the clean energy sector in the U.S. in recent years. And those jobs are in renewable energy generation, energy efficiency, smart grid and storage, cleaner fuels, and lower emission vehicles. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes to complete my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Nearly 500,000 of these clean energy jobs are in the solar and wind industries, and 1 out of every 6 construction workers in this country now make their living in energy efficiency. 1 out of every 5 companies involved in making motor vehicle parts make their money from products that make our cars, our trucks, and our vans cleaner. Our clean energy revolution did not happen by accident. We put smart policies in place, and we had leadership that believed climate change was a threat. During the Obama administration, starting with the Recovery Act, the federal government provided economic incentives and smart regulations to support market investments in clean energy. We must build on this progress, continue to support policies that reduce our nation's carbon footprint, help create a more robust economy, and support those most vulnerable to climate change. But instead of pursuing any ideas to address climate change and protect Americans from its effect, the Trump administration has sadly decided to ignore climate change, decided to defund clean energy research, and roll back any meaningful climate action, decided to walk away from provisions that would help protect Americans from rising floods and other extreme weather events. Our president's failed leadership on climate change threatens our health, our economy, U.S. competitiveness, and our future. And sadly, most of our, not all, but most of our Republican friends have been applauding the president with every action. In conclusion, let me just say to the American people, don't be fooled or distracted by these political games. We cannot allow cynicism to win. We can reduce our nation's carbon footprint, we can strengthen our economy, and we can support those most vulnerable among us. Indeed, we must. Climate change is real. Human activity is the dominant cause. Congress needs to act. Let's stop the political theater and start to address the climate change before us today while we still have time. And we do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.